So, studying First Corinthians this semester, and what we're going to do tonight, starting next week, we're going to start moving through the letter very slowly. Next week, we're just doing chapter 1, and so I'll send you a schedule and give you a sense of what we'll be reading. If you get a chance this week, and please don't worry if you can't do this, you don't get around to doing it. I never want anybody to kind of an hour before this meeting think, I didn't read any First Corinthians this week, I probably just shouldn't even go. Come, even if you haven't thought about First Corinthians for a moment all week long. But if you get a chance, I would encourage you to try to sit down and in one sitting, and it shouldn't take you more than an hour, hour and a half, and you could do this for your quiet time at some point this week, try to read all 16 chapters together. Now, what that requires, among other things, is don't slow down. If something mystifies you, just keep reading. If something makes you angry, just keep reading. If something makes you really excited and you want to get in more in depth, just keep reading. But I would encourage you, especially after we get into the background tonight that we're going to get into, to step back at some point this week and read all of First Corinthians. And then next week, we'll actually start looking at the individual chapters, starting with chapter 1. So, and by the way, for those of you who are newer, interrupt at any point, ask questions at any point, disagree and push back at any point. Ask me to slow down, whatever you want. This can be super interactive. Basically, there's two things I want to do tonight. As we begin studying 1 Corinthians this semester, I want you to have two images in your mind on a regular basis, and I'm going to give these to you, and then I'm going to flesh them out. The first image is, as you're reading 1 Corinthians this semester, and as we study it each week, I want you to imagine that you're walking into a room, and somebody is on the phone, and you know this person. They're a good friend of yours. You've had a relationship with them for a long time. But when you walk into the room, you can tell they've already been in this phone conversation for a while. It didn't start right when you walked in the room. Maybe it's been going on for 30 minutes. Maybe it's been going on for 10 minutes. But the conversation is already kind of like halfway through. And you can only hear what your friend is saying. You have no idea who's on the other side of the phone or what the other person is saying. And imagine in that situation, trying to reconstruct from that limited data and that limited perspective what the conversation is about. Every time your friend says something, trying to be like, what is he responding to? What is she trying to get that person to do or trying to speak into their life? And the reason I have that image in mind, and I would encourage you to think about it, is compared to, say, Romans, which shows up right before 1 Corinthians in the New Testament, like 1 Corinthians is written by Paul, like 1 Corinthians is also 16 chapters long, nonetheless, Romans and 1 Corinthians could not be more different from each other. When you read Romans, not to say there aren't challenging aspects of it, but when you read Romans, it all makes sense on its own terms. Paul is just explaining from the ground up, here's what the Christian faith is. And it just makes sense intrinsically. 1 Corinthians, as we're going to see, and if you have your handout, I encourage you to pull it out, and we're going to start looking at some stuff. Turn to chapter 5. Now, while the verse numbers are not on your handout, there are chapter numbers in red. So you can see on the third page, chapter 5, verse 1. One of the things that you notice quickly about 1 Corinthians, if you're really paying attention, is that it picks up in the middle of a conversation that's already been going on for a while. And so chapter 5, verse 1. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that's not tolerated even among pagans, for a man has his father's wife. That is, a guy's having an affair with his stepmom. Now, if you look down to the last paragraph in chapter 5, notice how it begins. I, past tense, wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. So, here's something we learned right away. 1 Corinthians is a bit of a misnomer. This is not the first letter Paul has written to this church. There are already other letters he wrote to them in the past. So this is at best 2 Corinthians, technically. Maybe it's even 4th or 5th Corinthians, for all we know. Paul has already written them at least one letter, very likely more than one. And one of the things that we realize right away is he says, I didn't mean the sexually immoral of this world, that is, non-Christians outside of the church, or the greedy, swindlers, idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world to avoid those people. What I'm writing to you now in this letter is not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother or sister who's doing this. So 1 Corinthians is 1, picking up a conversation that's already been going on, 2, responding to misunderstandings this church has about things Paul has said in the past, and if you jump ahead just a little more to chapter 7 on the next page, Look at the beginning of chapter 7, verse 1. And this will be a good one for us to begin looking at a theme that's prominent in 1 Corinthians. Chapter 7, verse 1 says this, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote to me." Which means the Corinthians have also already written letters to Paul. And 1 Corinthians is in part Paul answering questions that they asked him in a previous letter. Now, here's why all of this is relevant. We don't have any of these letters. We don't have the letters Paul wrote to them. We don't have the letters they wrote to Paul. And so, like walking into a room where somebody's talking on the phone and you don't know who they're talking to or what the conversation before it has been like, you have to do some detective work to make sense of it. And so one of the things that we will see pretty regularly this semester, some of you this might be fun or exciting, others of you it might be really frustrating, others of you it might just be, strange or, not sure what your reaction is, but we are going to have to do a lot of detective work on a regular basis to understand what this letter means. This is one of the harder documents to understand in the New Testament because of this dynamic. We don't know exactly what was going on in the Corinthian church. We don't know exactly what they and Paul were talking about in the years, and it literally was years that they had a relationship with each other before Paul wrote this letter. Conservatively speaking, Paul probably has known this group for at least 3 or 4 years. That's a lot of time for a relationship to form, and this is the beginning of our access to that relationship. And so for us to understand it is to, by definition, try to reconstruct a lot of background that we're at best kind of speculating about at times. And so here's the first thing I want you to notice. If you have a pen, you might consider doing this. The first 2 words in chapter 7, and this is the ESV, you can use whatever translation you like, but in the ESV, the first 2 words are "now concerning." And if you have a pen, I would encourage you to circle those 2 words, underline them, somehow draw attention to them. We're going to see, as simple as they are, these 2 words show up often in 1 Corinthians, and they always indicate something crucial that will help us understand the letter better. So, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. It is good for a man not to have sex with a woman. So I'm going to make a bunch of random comments tonight, even more than I usually do. But I would bet that whether you grew up in the church or not, whether you yourself hold this or not, whether you hate this view or not, or whether you're not sure, that you have some sense that for a long time the Apostle Paul has had a reputation of being a misogynist who didn't like women very much. That's actually a pretty common view of the Apostle Paul in history. And a lot of the view that's out there for the Apostle Paul in this actually comes from 1 Corinthians 7 and comes in part because of this statement, it's good for a man not to have sex with a woman. And what do you notice about that statement grammatically? How does it stand out to you visibly the way it's laid out there? There's something that's going on there, which we're going to see happens a lot in 1 Corinthians. And if we see it a certain way, it makes a big difference in how we read the letter. What's different about the phrase or the sentence, "It is good for a man not to have sex with a woman"?
It is not good for a man to have sex with a woman.
Okay. What about it?
The negation.
Okay. It's definitely a negative command, but there are a lot of negative statements in 1 Corinthians, but there's something even more simple about it that stands out. Nalda, did you see something?
Yeah, it seems weird that he's like not talking to a woman at all.
Okay.
It's like directed to a man.
Okay. Yeah, it's certainly a male-centered perspective in this statement. It's good for a man not to have sex with a woman. That's also true.
You're referring to that it's in quotes?
Yeah, the fact that it's in quotation marks. And here's something that's interesting that will help you grasp this a little more. Those quotation marks are not, Paul didn't write those quotation marks. The Greek language doesn't even have quotation marks. Those quotation marks are not in the manuscripts for 1 Corinthians. That's a modern editor, a modern translator adding those. And every time this happens in 1 Corinthians, and it doesn't usually happen in most of Paul's letters, it always signifies that modern scholars believe that's not Paul's statement. That's something the Corinthians said to him in a previous letter that he's citing back to them and then responding to. So imagine, now we haven't read this chapter yet, we'll spend an entire week on chapter 7 when we get here in a month or so, but imagine if you read this chapter thinking that the beginning statement Paul makes is, guys, it's good for a man not to have sex with a woman, or if the beginning statement is, now, you guys wrote to me saying, Paul, it's good for a man not to have sex with a woman, right? What do you think about that? And the rest of the chapter is Paul responding to it, as I think is clearly the case, in showing why that's a stupid idea to hold. It completely changes the way you understand the chapter. Let me give you another example. If you look at the end of chapter 6, right above that, the chapter right above it, look at how it starts. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. But the body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord is meant for the body. Notice, if you understand the quotation marks there to be not Paul's view, but what the Corinthians have been espousing, what they've been writing to him and saying, Paul, you agree with this, right? It very much changes the way you understand it. If you've ever read Paul's letters or heard a sermon or somebody try to describe something the New Testament says, you probably have a sense that the Apostle Paul went around pretty regularly summing up the Christian faith by saying things like, guys, we're not saved by our works, we're saved by faith. Guys, we're not saved by obeying the law, we're saved by what Jesus did for us in his death and resurrection. That is, we're not under the law, we're under grace. Paul clearly said stuff like that a lot. Now, the Corinthians almost certainly have understood him to mean, as many Christians throughout history have understood Paul to mean, we can do whatever we want. This is great. Jesus died for us and we can do whatever we want now? Yeah, we're not under the law, but that doesn't mean that all things are helpful. Yes, we're not under the law, but that doesn't mean that all actions are beneficial. Paul is responding to a perspective that they have communicated to him previously that they've misunderstood. So going back to the beginning of chapter 7, and then I'll throw it out to you guys here in a minute, now concerning is a two-word phrase that every time it shows up in 1 Corinthians, and this is the first time it shows up in chapter 7, every time it shows up, it pretty clearly indicates that Paul is citing something they wrote him in a previous letter, and he's responding to it. So jump ahead to the beginning of chapter 8. Actually, sorry, not even that. Midway through chapter 7. The very top of the next page, the first full paragraph in the second half of chapter 7 on the next page says, now concerning the betrothed. The first half of chapter 7 is addressing Christians who in one form or another are married. They're currently married. They're married to a non-Christian. They used to be married, but their spouse left them. They used to be married, but their spouse died. Everything in the first half of chapter 7 is, Paul, now that we're Christians, what does that mean for being married? Like sex is kind of dirty, right? Like women, they're kind of inferior. Like we should probably just move on and like just be spiritual instead, right? And the rest of the first half of chapter 7 is Paul giving them advice for what the gospel means for Christians who are married. And then starting in the second half of chapter 7, now concerning the betrothed, it's Christians who are single. What about Christians who aren't married? What about Christians who are engaged but not quite married? Should we just not even get married because, maybe Jesus is coming back soon, or maybe, the body doesn't really matter, maybe sex is unspiritual and dirty. Maybe we just shouldn't get married. And the rest of chapter 7 is Paul responding to the questions they've been asking him about what does it mean to be single if you're a Christian. But if you don't understand that background, you'll miss a lot of what Paul is saying there. And so reconstructing the kinds of mistakes, the kinds of ideas the Corinthians are thinking is really crucial to understanding what Paul says. And again, just to use this image one last time, when we read 1 Corinthians, we're hearing one side of a phone conversation, but to really understand it, we need to reconstruct what's going on in the other end of the line. Look at the beginning of chapter 8. Now concerning food that has been offered to idols. Now, this is one of those sections in 1 Corinthians where modern Christians, including me often, we kind of begin rolling our eyes and we're like, this has nothing to do with me. Because you read these chapters, the next 3 chapters are basically saying, hey, Paul, in this ancient context where there were temples in the city and people would go and they would hang out and have parties in a pagan temple where the food that you ate on Friday night had been offered to Zeus or Poseidon in honor to them before you ate it, we're like, that's not our issue today. I don't wrestle with that at all. But in another sense, we do, This is basically the question, hey, Paul, all that stuff we used to do with our non-Christian friends, can we still do that? That's what this question is. But to understand what Paul's answers are, we have to understand what the questions are, what their specific dynamics were. And so the next 3 chapters are basically, Paul, how are we allowed or not allowed to engage with the non-Christian friendships, the non-Christian culture around us that we used to participate in, that we used to be in the midst of? In these next 3 chapters are Paul giving his thoughts in response to that question that they asked him. And as we're going to see when we read these chapters, there's one group of Christians in Corinth who are like, oh yeah, we definitely can't do that anymore. Christians can't do that. And there's another group saying, Zeus doesn't really exist. Of course we can go there and eat that food because we're not doing it for Zeus, we're doing it for Jesus, so we can do it. But they're arguing with each other over it, and it's leading to conflict, and Paul speaks into it. And again, unless you understand that background, so much of what Paul is saying doesn't make sense. If you jump ahead to chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 1. Now concerning spiritual gifts, brothers and sisters. And this is the very famous or infamous 3 chapters where we are one body but many members. The love is patient, love is kind, chapter in 13. And in 14, speaking in tongues and prophecy. Now, for all of that, which we'll get into when the time comes, it's basically this. Like us today, and this is going to be the second major thing we do in the next few minutes, ancient Corinth, as different as it was from the modern world, is, as we're going to see, shockingly similar to New York City in so many ways. And like New York City, Corinth was a place of unspeakable diversity. Every race, every culture, every ethnicity, every socioeconomic status, different personality types, different vocations. When you went to the marketplace, the agora, kind of in the same way that if you go to the Times Square subway stop, you look around and you're like, I can't believe how many different people there are in this city. And when people come together, and like in New York City today, for all the diversity we have, the reality is, hey, row it. For all the diversity we have, it's also true, and this is true in ancient Corinth too, that people don't actually hang out with people who are different from them very much. Most people, even in a very diverse place, they only really spend time with people who are like them, who are from the same race, from the same education background, the same geographical location, the same socioeconomic status. And so most of the Corinthians, when they became Christians, all of a sudden they're hanging out with people who come from every conceivable walk of life, and they're not used to hanging out with each other. And I don't know if this is anybody's experience here. I have often been struck in the many, many years I've been a Christian at this point, when I look around the room and I think, I just wouldn't be hanging out with hardly any of you if I wasn't a Christian. Because that's what holds us together. And I love that, but it also presents a lot of dilemmas and a lot of frustrating dynamics, a lot of miscommunication, a lot of hurt feelings, a lot of wrongs are done in those kinds of settings when there's diversity. In chapters 12, 13, and 14 are basically the Corinthians saying, how are we supposed to make sense of our diversity? And like always happens in a fallen world, and again, I don't want to jump ahead too much because we'll get into this more, but whenever I read these chapters, I think of this somewhat comical but also tragic story in the Gospels, where in the Gospel of in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus and his disciples are walking to Jerusalem. And Jesus, for the first time, begins openly speaking about the fact that, guys, when we get to Jerusalem, I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to be betrayed, I'm going to be beaten and flogged, I'm going to be tortured, and then I'm going to be crucified. And it's really dark. And do you remember how the disciples respond? Among other things, they're like, yeah, whatever, Jesus, but which one of us do you think is the greatest? They immediately point to themselves, and they notice that like some of them are zealots, some of them are Pharisees, some of them are Sadducees. They come from all different branches of Judaism, and they're like, which of us is the greatest? In a fallen world, and I know that you're all aware of this, but it's good to name it specifically. In a fallen world, it's always about 2 nanoseconds behind the moment that we identify, oh, we're not all the same. We're different from each other, that somebody says, and one of those differences is better, and one of them is worse. One of them is more valuable, another is more inferior. When we begin making value judgments about diversity, you could actually, I think, make a good argument that a lot of what goes wrong in human history comes from the value judgments we associate with the diversity that we see. And in these chapters, the Corinthians are trying to put value judgments on the diversity, saying, those of us who speak in tongues, we're the really spiritual ones, right, Paul? Hey, those of us who don't speak in tongues, we're the really spiritual ones, right, Paul? And Paul responds to this where they don't know what to do with their diversity, and he encourages them how to think about and how to respond to their diversity in light of the gospel. But again, unless we know that background, we'll miss so much of what he says here. Then finally, chapter 16. Then we'll jump all the way back to the beginning, and I'll throw it up to you guys. Chapter 16, verse 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints. Like many Christians throughout history, especially when you first become a Christian, if you don't come from a Christian background, the Corinthians notice that our leaders ask us for money. That's weird. What's that about? Why are we asked to give money in church to the body of Christ? And they're asking Paul, why do we have to give any money as part of our Christian faith? And this last section of chapter 16 is Paul trying to walk through why supporting other Christians who are poorer than you and who have needs that you don't have is a crucial part of responding to the gospel rightly. Now, this isn't even close to all of the things that we're going to see as we go through 1 Corinthians, but in a nutshell, almost everything from chapter 5 on in 1 Corinthians is Paul responding to a problem that's already there, a question they've already raised, and if we don't understand what the background is, we will at best miss a lot of what's going on, and at worst misunderstand what Paul is actually saying. And so as we go through 1 Corinthians this semester, again, we're going to have to do detective work. And so we'll do a little of that tonight in the time we have left, but on the handout that I gave you, the Gospel in the Marketplace, if you pull this out, and I encourage you to kind of keep this with you as you study through 1 Corinthians this semester. You can see that the structure is laid out on the first page. And basically the structure will lay out so that you don't lose the forest for the trees, how section after section Paul is responding to issues in light of the gospel. And so let me say one last thing and then I'll throw it to you guys for now. Here's what I think every section of 1 Corinthians has in common. For all the complexities of it, all the confusion of it, in every section of 1 Corinthians, something is happening in the church where their background in their Greco-Roman culture is influencing their behavior towards one another, their understanding of who they are, more than the gospel. And in every section of 1 Corinthians, Paul is encouraging them to think through what it looks like to live out the gospel on all of these issues. And so as we'll study 1 Corinthians this semester, we'll see many times their issues are not our issues, but many times they are. And even when they're not our issues, here in a nutshell is why 1 Corinthians is so valuable. And I'll be honest, if you're anything like me, maybe you've been frustrated by this in the Bible at times. Have you ever read a passage in the Bible where you're commanded to do something, or you're commanded not to do something, and you're not told why? You're just kind of told, don't do this, do this. You're like, why? 1 Corinthians, maybe more than anywhere else in the New Testament, constantly gives the why underneath the what. Paul never in this letter simply says, do this, don't do that. He says, I think you guys should go left, or I think you should go right, because. And then he walks them through the shape of the gospel. And so even when it's issues that we're not struggling with per se, it still helps us to understand the logic of the gospel in our cultural situation today. So anyway, that's the first image I want you to think of, walking into a room where somebody's talking on the phone and you don't know what a lot of what's going on the other side of the conversation. So let me throw it out to you guys. Thoughts, questions about that, things that don't make sense about it, things that seem strange about it.
Are there any other letters that are similar in that there's a whole kind of preamble we're not aware of?
Not nearly to this degree, but it's a long ways away, so we'll see if we do this. But if we would do 2 Corinthians next semester, 2 Corinthians isn't quite to the same degree, but it's still a very, what you would call maybe a polemical or a responsive kind of document. The only other one that I would say, but because it's so short, it is different, but Galatians is very similar in that, like when you read Galatians, and this is often missed, but Galatians is the only letter Paul writes where Paul usually, and even in 1 Corinthians we'll see, Paul says, hey, I'm Paul, you guys are the Corinthians, Good to see you again. And then he gives thanks to God for something. Even in Corinth, where the whole church is like in flames and it's just a mess, he still finds something to give thanks for in chapter 1. In Galatians, it's the only letter where he doesn't give thanks. He says, hey, I'm Paul, you're the Galatians. Oh, foolish Galatians. And he just jumps right in with a rebuke. And the whole letter is basically, since he left the church and founded it and they became Christians through him, an outside group has come in, which they've embraced and agreed with this outside group that Paul's kind of an idiot. And so they've completely veered off course. And everything in Galatians requires that you understand what the issues are to understand it. Yeah. So Galatians would be somewhat similar in that sense. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions for now? And again, a lot of this might seem abstract, might seem boring, but it's all so that as we study the letter more specifically throughout the semester, we can understand it better. Okay. Let's go on to the second one. Here's the other image I want you to have. As you read 1 Corinthians, I really want you to think on a regular basis about all the experiences you have in New York City on a regular basis. Walking through Central Park and seeing all these different people, waiting for the subway in a crowded station, walking through a store on Fifth Avenue or whatever, just going into a restaurant where you're crowded. I want you to think about all the overwhelming, crazy experiences you have in New York City on a regular basis, with the bustle of the city, the stress of the city, the intensity of the city, and maybe more than anything else, the diversity of the city. And so I want to lay out a couple of reasons why ancient Corinth, of all the cities of the ancient world, was more similar to New York than any other city, and why this should help us kind of affiliate with this letter as we go. So here's the first one. Corinth, like New York City, was a new city, not an old city. New York City is very different than Paris and London, cities that have histories of thousands of years. Most of us who live in New York City right now, most of us didn't grow up here. The vast majority of people living in Manhattan right now, they weren't here 5 years ago, and they're not going to be here 5 years from now. New York City is very strange that way. Even those who, say, live on the Upper East Side and they're living in some mansion, probably their families weren't wealthy 3 generations ago. New York City is a city mostly of new money, not of old money. It's somewhere people come to make a name for themselves, not somewhere where the status quo just stays similar. And so in about 150 BC, that's less than 200 years before this letter was written, Corinth decided, very unwisely, to participate in a rebellion against the Roman Empire. And in response, the Roman Empire utterly destroyed it. And it was uninhabited for 100 years. In about 45 BC, Julius Caesar decided to rebuild the city of Corinth. That's less than 100 years before Paul writes this letter, and this city, as Paul writes to it, is less than 100 years old. 95% of the city's population didn't grow up there. Most of them are former slaves. Most of them are former soldiers who have relocated there either as a reward for serving in the Roman Empire or to make a name and to make a fortune for themselves once they were freed from slavery. But almost everyone is new. And maybe the dominating reality of first century Corinth, which is strikingly similar to New York, was competition over status and a profound commitment to upward mobility. Corinth was dominated by people who weren't content with where they were now, but wanted to become something, wanted to gain something that they didn't yet have. And so it was a city that was filled with competition. It was a city that was filled with conflict. It was a city that was filled with hedonism, greed, and the lust for power. And in that sense, it was profoundly similar to New York City today. There's actually an old motto that's been found in both Latin and Greek texts that people would use for Corinth all over the Roman Empire. And it's so funny how similar it is to a motto that we should know. And the motto is this: Corinth is not for every man. That's the motto. Which is kind of a negative, more cynical take on, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere, right? It's basically the same motto. Corinth isn't for everybody. If you can make it there, you can make it everywhere. Corinth is in so many ways. Its newness, its obsession with upward mobility, the fact that no one is from there, the fact that people are so diverse from each other. There's very little that holds people together in this place. And the diversity, more often than not, was a cause of conflict and not of flourishing. Very, very similar to New York City. And as we're going to see, virtually every problem that's raging in the Corinthian church has to do with their cultural background and how it's in dissonance with their new embrace of the gospel. So let me give you one example. Jump to chapter 7, which we already looked at briefly. This is a passage that I'll bet a lot of you, even if you've read Paul a lot over the years, even if you read the Bible on a regular basis, I'll bet it's not a very familiar, well-known passage to you. And yet I'm going to argue as we go through 1 Corinthians this semester that this is a really good summary of a lot of what Paul's saying here. And I already briefly tried to explain a few minutes ago that the first half of chapter 7 is Paul giving advice to different Christians who are married. And the second half of the chapter is Paul giving advice to different Christians who are currently single. In between those two sections, the last paragraph at the bottom of the page that starts chapter 7, the paragraph starts, only let each person lead that life. Do you see that paragraph? This paragraph sums up the logic that Paul is using for why he gives the advice he gives. And I would say not just for this chapter, not just to these issues, but for much of 1 Corinthians. And I want you to notice that 3 times in this one paragraph, he repeats a single exhortation. And it's one that, to be honest, I think would scare most of us, including me, to take seriously in our lives. And so we'll have to think about as we get there, what does Paul actually mean by this? But here's what he says. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. It's the first time he says it. This is my rule in all the churches. This is what Christians in general should be committed to. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? That is, ethnically Jewish. Then don't seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Don't think that being Jewish is somehow wrong and seek to become a Gentile. That's a mistake. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? That is, a Gentile. Don't think that the gospel means that Gentiles are worse than Jews and go out and seek circumcision, because neither circumcision, being ethnically Jewish, counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, being ethnically a Gentile. The only thing that matters is keeping the commands of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. There's the second time he says it. Whatever condition you were called in, that is, whatever your life looked like when you became a Christian, Paul's saying, just stay there. Just keep doing that. Were you a slave? Bondservant is a cop-out of the translation. Were you a slave when called? And Paul's advice is, don't be concerned about it. That's, I think, a misleading translation. A better one, I think, would be, don't despair about it. And yet, you can see he immediately gives an exception. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. But even for slaves, Paul's main advice is to remain where you are. Jews, Gentiles, free slave, men, women, rich, poor, all of it. And going to the end of the chapter, so brothers and sisters, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain or stay with God. Now, a couple of thoughts. One is, what's up with all the slavery stuff? And yes, we will talk about that as we get there this semester. 1 Corinthians also has a lot of strange statements about gender, which we'll also talk about when we get there this semester. But for now, what's up with Paul saying that you should just remain where you are, whatever your condition was? Does that mean that, like, when I became a Christian, if I was a doctor, that I need to be a doctor for the rest of my life and I can't change my job? Does it mean that if I lived in New Jersey, I can't move to Pennsylvania? Like, what does this advice mean? For now, we already saw, not necessarily, Paul does give a very obvious exception. Slaves, if you can gain your freedom. Yes, gain your freedom. But if you can't, don't despair. Remain where you are. I would suggest for now that Paul is responding to a culture suspiciously like ours. And in my experience, very few churches in places like New York City actually push back on our culture here. We tend to just reflect our culture here, where it's so obvious to us as modern New Yorkers that the move up and onward is always the obvious move. That the job that pays more, the job I don't have yet, the recognition I haven't yet achieved in my status, that's of course always more important than whatever I'm doing right now. And what kind of a life does that lead to psychologically in our own lives? What does that do in communities? Well, I've noticed over the years that people are really stressed out all the time if they live like that. They're always not really present where they are and always dreaming about the future. They tend to see other human beings around them, especially in their same programs at work or in grad school, as competitors and not as neighbors, because the pie's only so big, and if you get a piece of the pie, then there's less for me, so you tend to compete with one another. And it tends to lead to this culture where you're never really engaged right now. You're always saying, when I finally get there, when I graduate, then I'll start doing the stuff I should be doing. When I get married, then I'll be doing the stuff I should be doing. When I make enough money, when my name is secure, then I'll be doing this stuff. Richard Hayes, who's a famous New Testament scholar, teaches at Duke. He's got a great paraphrase of this paragraph where he says, what Paul is saying is this: bloom wherever you are planted. Be present right here, right now. God uses everyone, whatever role they have in the body of Christ. And to think, oh, I'm a slave, I can't be used by God, that's a mistake. Oh, I'm a freedman, I'm definitely on the winning side in life. Maybe not. Whatever our condition is, that's the calling in which God wants to use us right here, right now. That doesn't necessarily mean we can never move out of that, but it does mean this obsession we have that life doesn't make sense until I get somewhere I'm not right now is actually in conflict with the gospel. The gospel actually undermines that as an attitude in life. And one of the things that the church should look different from those around us in a place like New York is to actually not have the quest for upward mobility be the dominant thing that drives us all the time. And so what would that look like if we reflected the gospel more there? So again, I know that this probably raises tons of questions for you. It does for me too. But these are the kinds of things that are going on in first century Corinth and that Paul is responding to. Go back to the beginning of chapter 1. I'll throw this one out, and then we'll wrap up here in a couple of minutes with just getting ready for reading the rest of 1 Corinthians. I already mentioned briefly that in places that are as diverse as New York City today or Corinth in the ancient world, there's always a sense, and I'll admit, I grew up in New Jersey and New York. I went to college in North Carolina. I always feel a sense of pride of coming from a place that's really diverse. And whenever I'm in like rural North Carolina where everybody looks exactly the same, I always feel a sense of superiority to those places. Like, oh, the diversity in New York, we're so much more tolerant, we're so much more worldly, we're so much more, whatever. And it's not to say that there aren't good things about New York, and it's not to say that there aren't bad things about other places. All that's true. But it is true that New York City, for all of its diversity, is not a very tolerant place. New York City, for all of its diversity, is not a place where people come together in community. It's a place where within the overall city, you find people who look like you, think like you, vote like you, and you hang out with them. Because New York City is part of a fallen world. And so that's what we do. And so, like in the ancient world, it's often, now, unfortunately, American churches have, for a while, not done this well, but it has often been the case in history that churches in diverse places are often one of the only places where people actually spend time together who have nothing in common with each other, racially, culturally, socioeconomically, apart from the fact that they're followers of Jesus. But for all of our maybe temptation to romanticize the church like that, and I do think that's a good thing when the church is like that, it's hard to be in community with people that you have almost nothing in common with. It's really hard. And almost every single issue going on in Corinth is rising up out of the combination of, I don't really like these other Christians I'm hanging out with in church every day, and two, the culture is driving their behavior and their ideology more than the gospel is. And so, last thing I'll do for tonight, chapter 1. The first 9 verses of chapter 1 are the greeting, the introduction. The body of the letter starts in verse 10. And we're going to do chapter 1 next week. But the body of the letter starts, I think it's about 4 paragraphs down in your handout, with this. I appeal to you, brothers and sisters or siblings, the family of God, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. Now, next week we'll look at that a lot more in depth, but most scholars argue, and I think they're right, that that statement is the thesis of all of 1 Corinthians. All of 1 Corinthians is pursuing that goal. In the midst of a church that is utterly in conflict and division with each other over every single issue that the rest of the letter talks about, Paul's goal is that they would be a family again, unified, treating each other with respect. And so let me just mention a couple of things to flesh this out, and then I'll throw it to you guys, and we'll end tonight. The first thing is that every issue you read about in 1 Corinthians, and again, if you get a chance to read the whole letter this week, I really do think a ton of stuff will stand out in a new way, having done this background. But every single issue has this in common. Hey, how should we think about spiritual gifts, Paul? Hey, how should we think about food that's been sacrificed to idols before you eat it? Hey, Paul, what should we think about being married or being single? There's always the issue itself in the way that they're thinking about it from their Greco-Roman background. But the real issue is that within the church, there's one group that says A, there's one group that says B, there's one group that says C over the issue, and they're all fighting with each other over it. And what Paul ultimately wants is for them to have unity with each other. And so the unity of the church is the goal of 1 Corinthians. And again, there are different ways that we can avoid unity. We can just break up into different denominations and hang out with Christians who look like us and think like us and sing like us and have the same temperaments as us. That's one way to avoid it. We can just endlessly fight with each other. We could throw up our hands and say, it doesn't really matter what you believe. You believe this, I believe that. Who even knows what the truth is? Or you could do what Paul tries to do in 1 Corinthians. And so here's the last thing I'll say, which is it's very easy to understand this statement, even this exhortation. I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. It would be somewhat easy to hear that as Paul saying, I want you to all think exactly the same thing about everything in the universe. But if you read the rest of the letter, that is clearly not what he means. This is not a call for uniformity. It's a call for unity, which is not the same thing. As we're going to see, Paul often responds to their issues by saying, let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. You think you can't eat food offered idols? Don't eat it. You think you can? Eat it, as long as you don't make somebody else stumble. He is not trying to get all Christians to think the same way, behave the same way, experience God the same way, but he is trying to get all of them to relate to each other through the beauty and the logic of the gospel. And so within the church, there will always be diversity, not in just the way we look, not just in our socioeconomic status and background, but even in what we think is true about aspects of who God is and what he's doing in the world, how we ought to worship him, how we ought to follow Jesus. There is a legitimate diversity within the church on lots of those issues, and there can still be unity even in the midst of it. But those things can often cause us to just erupt in wars and conflicts with each other too. And so all of 1 Corinthians, for all of its complexity, is just ultimately an appeal for Christians to love each other in unity. That's all it is. And so I hope that to some degree this gets you excited to read the letter and study it this semester. It is a harder letter to understand, but I can basically promise you that if you dig deep into this letter with us, you will be astounded at how brilliant this letter is in the way that it will be relevant to our lives as Christians, as New Yorkers, as people who are very different from each other. And so I'm very, very excited to study it with you guys. Let me throw it to you guys. Thoughts, questions about any of that? And again, next week we'll actually just start looking at chapter 1 together, and we'll just actually break it down and interact over it. But a lot of this background is pretty crucial to understand what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians. If anyone is interested on your own, we won't do it together, but in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 18 is the story of Paul coming to Corinth for the first time and founding the church. So if you want to read that, you can. We might reference it a few times here and there, But again, Paul has known these Christians for a good 3 or 4 years by the time he writes 1 Corinthians.
What chapter did you get?
Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18. And a figure shows up there who's quite significant in 1 Corinthians, whose name is Apollos. And you'll see that Apollos in Acts 18, the first thing that's emphasized about him is that he's very skilled as a public orator and with rhetoric, with wisdom, which is very valued in the ancient world. It's actually another thing that Corinth has in common with New York City. It's obsessed with celebrity culture. People who are impressive publicly, those are the people you want to be hanging out with. And Apollos is a bit of a celebrity in the Corinthian church. He's really persuasive and compelling. Maybe he's really good looking, maybe he's got a great voice, whatever it is, but people like him. And when he gets up and he speaks, people listen. And maybe you know this, maybe not. Paul actually explicitly says it in 2 Corinthians, but Paul was not impressive in person. Paul was not a good speaker. He was probably not a very good-looking guy, and people were regularly unimpressed by him in person. And so a big theme in the first 4 chapters is actually the relationship between Paul and Apollos, and some of the Corinthians saying, I'm of Apollos, and others saying, I'm of Peter, and others saying, I'm of Paul, and Paul saying, who is Paul? Who is Apollos? And so another theme we'll get into this semester is what is the nature and role of leadership in the church? We often, in places like New York City, really like to have celebrity pastors who are really gifted. And we tend to think that that's one of the most important things to have as a church. And in that, we're almost certainly not reflecting the values of the gospel, but the values of a place like New York City. That doesn't mean that Apollos is a bad guy. That doesn't mean that gifted pastor is a bad guy. It does mean that we need to be very careful about overly, inordinately valuing that and missing other things that should also be valued in the body of Christ. And so again, I think week after week, we're just going to see so many points of contact with life as Christians in New York City, for life in Corinth for these ancient believers. Okay.
Did you